For 7 years, every Thursday afternoon without fail, a courier van from Northgate Medical Group pulled up outside the same small physiotherapy clinic on a quiet street in Sudbury, Ontario, and left another stack of patient files on the front step. No call ahead, n'exploitant, no thank you. Just a rubber-banded pile of folders, a sticky note with a turnaround deadline. And the assumption that someone inside would figure it out. The someone was always the same person. Declan Marsh was 41 years old, and he had the kind of hands that told you everything before he said a word. Slightly rough at the knuckles, careful and deliberate in the way they moved. He ran Marsh Physiotherapy out of a converted Victorian row house 2 blocks from a Tim Hortons he'd been going to since university. The waiting room held 6 chairs, and a small table with magazines nobody ever updated. The treatment rooms smelled like liniment and pine cleaner. Not impressive by any measure that matters in a corporate brochure, but the people who came to Declan, usually the ones who'd already been through hospital systems and specialist queues and still couldn't sleep on their left side, those people tended not to leave. He had a way of listening to a body, the same way a good mechanic listens to an engine, not just hearing the obvious, but catching what was underneath it. The slight hitch in a breath. The way someone shifted their weight, without knowing they were doing it. Patterns other practitioners missed because they were watching the clock. He had learned to read people early. Life had insisted on it. 6 years before Northgate Medical Group first dropped a file on his doorstep, Declan lost his wife Joanna to ovarian cancer. She was 34, their son, Theo, was 5. The kind of loss that doesn't announce itself as tragedy when it arrives. It just quietly removes the floor from under everything, and then you spend years rebuilding something to stand on. Declan rebuilt it the only way he knew how. Systematically. Wake at 6, make breakfast, pack Theo's lunch, school drop-off by 8:15, clinic open by 9, patients until 4:30, school pickup at 5, dinner, homework, bath, bed, then often back to the clinic files until 11, sleep, repeat. There was no template for it. No parenting manual for a grieving father. Trying to keep a business alive, while also not missing the school concert where his son played a reluctant triangle. He just kept moving forward because stopping was worse. Northgate Medical Group arrived in his professional life, quietly, and without ceremony, which was, in retrospect, an accurate preview of how they intended to operate. Northgate was the largest private healthcare management company in Northern Ontario, with administrative offices in Toronto, and a CEO whose name appeared regularly in business publications. Her name was Christine Belford. At the time Declan first received their files, Christine was 39, the youngest CEO in Northgate's history, and she had transformed the company from a regional administrator into something that now managed billing, patient flow, and specialist referral networks across 4 provinces. She was by every external measure, formidable. She had a talent for identifying inefficiencies and excising them. Under her leadership, Northgate's administrative overhead dropped significantly, processing times improved, investor returns climbed. Industry publications quoted her on the future of healthcare management. What they were less interested in reporting was what happened to the contractors who quietly made those efficiency numbers possible. Declan had never planned to become a Northgate contractor. They found him through a referral network, and the initial arrangement seemed reasonable. Northgate managed overflow physiotherapy assessments for clients in the Sudbury region, and Declan's clinic would handle the complex cases, the ones that required more time and expertise than the larger corporate clinics were willing to invest. He'd be paid per file. Standard contract. Straightforward. What became less straightforward was the volume, the pace, and the complete absence of any acknowledgement that a human being was on the receiving end of the arrangement. The files arrived every Thursday. Then Thursdays and Tuesdays. Then sometimes Monday mornings with a sticky note that said urgent in a font that suggested whoever typed it had never personally experienced urgency in their life. The cases themselves were genuinely difficult. Chronic pain patients with complicated histories, post-surgical recoveries that had stalled, neurological conditions that required lateral thinking and significant time. Exactly the kind of work that corporate physiotherapy networks had quietly stopped doing because it wasn't efficient. Declan did all of it. He did it because the contract helped keep his clinic viable. He did it because the patients needed someone who would actually look at their files. And he did it because he was, fundamentally, someone who did the work in front of him without requiring an audience. He sent invoices. Most were paid on time. Some were delayed. A few required follow-up emails that disappeared into a silence that Northgate's administrative system seemed to have perfected as a communication strategy. He never spoke to Christine Belford. He never spoke to anyone senior at Northgate. He exchanged emails occasionally with a contracts administrator named Shelley, who was professional and overworked and clearly had no authority over anything that mattered. 7 years, hundreds of patient files, dozens of genuinely complex recoveries, cases that would have otherwise slipped through the gaps of a system optimizing for speed. Christine, from her office tower in Toronto, never looked in his direction once. Then, in the span of about 4 months, Northgate Medical Group began to come apart. It started with a federal audit into billing practices across 3 provinces. Then a whistleblower complaint from inside the company about patient file mismanagement. Then a CBC investigation that ran across 2 news cycles and featured interviews with patients who had been misrouted, misbilled, or simply lost in the system. Northgate's stock, it had gone public 18 months earlier, a move Christine had championed, dropped 22% in 6 weeks. 3 senior executives left. 2 board members resigned. The legal bills started accumulating with the same enthusiasm that revenue was abandoning. Regional health authorities began reviewing their contracts with Northgate. Several chose not to renew. Christine gave one interview during this period, to the Globe and Mail, in which she described the situation as a complex regulatory environment, and pledged a comprehensive internal review. The reporter who wrote the piece was not visibly impressed. What Christine did not say publicly, could not say publicly, was that Northgate's internal systems were in worse shape than the audit had revealed. The patient file network, across all 4 provinces, had been built on a foundation that prioritized speed over integrity. Data was inconsistent, records had gaps. In several regions, the only reason client outcomes had remained defensible at all was because of independent contractors who had, quietly and without recognition, been doing real work on difficult cases. One of Northgate's own analysts, pulling together a crisis assessment in October, ran a regional outcome report for Northern Ontario and noticed something unusual. The Sudbury area cases had a notably better recovery and compliance rate than comparable regions. The analyst traced it back to the source: 1 clinic, 7 years of files, 1 name, Declan Marsh. Christine read the report on a Wednesday evening at her desk in Toronto. She read it twice, then she pulled Declan's contract file, which she had never opened, and looked at the volume of work it represented, the complexity of the cases, the consistency of the outcomes, the invoices, modest and methodical, going back to when Theo was still in primary school. She sat with it for a long time. On Friday morning, Christine Belford drove to Sudbury herself. No communications team, no assistant, no advance notice to anyone at the clinic. She found the address in the contract file, 114, Birchwood Street, and she stood outside a row house with a small painted sign in the window and a very ordinary door, and understood, for the first time, that she had been depending on this place for 7 years without ever having seen it. She went inside. The waiting room had 6 chairs and old magazines, and a hand-drawn poster on the wall that looked like a child had made it, which, as it turned out, Theo had. A labeled diagram of the human muscular system, slightly inaccurate around the shoulders, with Dad's Clinic written across the top in green marker. Declan was with a patient. Christine waited. There was nowhere to wait that felt appropriate for a CEO in a coat that cost more than the clinic's monthly utilities, and she was aware of this. When Declan came out and saw her, the recognition on his face was immediate. He knew exactly who she was. Everyone in healthcare administration in Northern Ontario knew Christine Belford's face. There was a silence that lasted about 4 seconds, and contained approximately 7 years' worth of subtext. "Messrs. Belford," he said, which was the most diplomatic thing he could have offered under the circumstances. "I should have called," she said. "You should have," he agreed. She had prepared something, a professional framing, a careful explanation that acknowledged the oversight without admitting legal liability. In the car, it had sounded measured and appropriate. Standing in his waiting room, under the hand-drawn poster, with Dade's Clinic in green marker, none of it came out the way she intended. What she said instead was closer to the truth: that Northgate was in serious trouble, that the patient outcome data from his region was the only part of their network that was clearly defensible, and that she needed to understand how he had been doing it so that she could salvage what remained of the company's obligations to approximately 4,000 active patients across the province. Declan listened without interrupting. He had the unhurried quality of someone who had learned not to spend energy on reactions he couldn't afford. Then he said, "Come in." He made coffee, the kind that came from a small machine that looked like it had been purchased used, and had never given him any trouble. And he sat across from her at a desk covered in organized folders, and he began to explain his process. Not to impress her, simply to answer her question. His approach, he told her, wasn't proprietary. He hadn't invented anything. He used standard assessment frameworks and followed clinical guidelines. The difference was time and attention. He actually read the full case histories, including the parts that previous practitioners had flagged as irrelevant. He built longitudinal notes, tracked patterns across sessions, caught things that only became visible if you were looking at the whole picture. "That's not efficient," Christine said, not as criticism, more as recognition of why her system had never done it. "No," Declan agreed. "It's not." He did not say, "You built a system that optimized for efficiency and then sent your hardest cases to the one person who hadn't." He didn't need to. She heard it anyway. What followed over the next several weeks was something neither of them had expected. Christine arranged for Declan to consult on Northgate's file remediation process. The crisis work of going back through thousands of incomplete patient records and identifying which cases needed immediate clinical attention. It was not glamorous. It was exactly the kind of methodical, detail-intensive work that Declan had been doing in a row house in Sudbury, while Christine's name was on magazine covers. He came to Toronto twice. Mostly he worked remotely, at the same desk with the organized folders, Theo doing homework 2 rooms away, a pot of something on the stove that filled the clinic with the smell of dinner. Christine called him directly more often than she called her own department heads. He answered with the same straightforwardness he brought to everything. No performance, no positioning, no awareness of the corporate hierarchy. She had spent her career building, and that now felt less useful than one person's willingness to look carefully at a file. She visited Sudbury again in November, this time with advance notice. Theo was at the clinic after school, working through a math problem at the front desk, while Declan finished with a patient. He was 12 by then, quiet, in the way of children who've had to grow up alongside adult grief, but not guarded. Curious. He asked Christine, with complete directness, whether she was the one who sent all the packages on Thursdays. "I didn't send them personally," she said, "but your company did." Yes. He considered this with the focused seriousness of someone doing actual arithmetic. "My dad always worked late on Thursdays," he said. "Because of those." Christine did not have a good answer for that, so she didn't offer one. Declan, from the doorway, watched this exchange and said nothing. Northgate's recovery, over the following months, was not dramatic. It did not make for a clean redemption arc that fit in a headline. The company settled parts of the regulatory complaint, restructured its contracts with regional health authorities, and began the slow work of rebuilding credibility with a skepticism that had been, honestly, earned. Several things Christine had built were dismantled because they should have been, but the patient file work, the actual clinical remediation, went better than the board had expected. Better than the legal team had expected. The outcome data from the corrected processes became, over time, a meaningful part of how Northgate rebuilt its case for continued operation. Christine made a decision in the spring that surprised almost everyone at the company. She offered Declan a formal position, Clinical Quality Director, with a remit to design the patient file standards that the company had never properly had. The contract was not the modest, per-file arrangement she had inherited from a procurement process no one remembered initiating. The terms were built around his actual constraints. No mandatory Toronto relocations, a schedule that accommodated Theo's school life, genuine authority over the clinical standards he'd be responsible for creating. Declan took 3 weeks to consider it. He consulted with his accountant. He talked to his sister, who told him he'd be an idiot not to take it. He talked to Theo, who asked whether he'd still have to make his own lunch. "Yes," Declan said. Then it doesn't change that much, Theo concluded, with the pragmatism of a 12-year-old who has learned to identify the things that actually matter. Declan accepted the position in April. The Marsh physiotherapy sign stayed in the window on Birchwood Street. The clinic continued operating, with a part-time associate handling the regular caseload, the Tim Hortons 2 blocks away unchanged. Thursday afternoons were different now. No courier van, no rubber-banded files left on the step. Instead there were scheduled calls, shared documents, a process that had his name on it, because he had built it. Christine still called him more than was strictly necessary for the formal arrangement. He had become, without either of them planning it, a check on her instincts. The kind of person who would say, clearly, and without apology, when something was being done for appearance, rather than effect. She had learned the hard way that those two things were not the same, and that no amount of efficiency metrics could substitute for someone who cared enough to read the whole file. Theo, for his part, updated the poster in the waiting room. The muscular diagram now had slightly more accurate shoulders. Dad's clinic was still written across the top in green marker. Some things, he had decided, didn't need to change. Sometimes the person who holds a system together is not the one at the top of the org chart. Sometimes they're 2 blocks from a Tim Hortons in Sudbury, working late on a Thursday, making sure the people nobody else made time for were actually going to be okay.